Project Binky in colour. Starring Nick Blackhurst. Also starring Richard Brunning. And Rex Hamilton as Abraham Lincoln. Tonight's episode, Engines of Change. Coming up in episode 30, Nick fails to get to grips with the new coffee machine. At the end of the previous episode, we'd completely stripped apart, blasted and powder-coated all of the crusty old running gear. We'd run the gauntlet of hydrogen embrittlement with a home plating kit. We'd replaced all the worn-out bushings with new polyurethane versions, and then reassembled the whole lot. That all looks great, but there's one very important thing missing.
Yeah, it's taken us 30 attempts to get to it, but this is actually the episode that most people have been looking forward to. No, not the one where we get the car in paint, sorry. The one where we actually take a look at the main motivation behind this project. The motor, the mill, the donk, the power plant, the ICE.
Alright Nick, don't labour the point.
The engine. No major surgery necessary because, as my daily driver, I put over 20,000 miles on that Celica with really no problems at all.
Not all those miles was sideways.
It did have a small oil leak, which we'll have to take a look at some point, but other than that, a lick of paint, a cam belt and an oil and filter change, and it should be good to go. Or at least that was the plan, until my colleague decided to take a look at that small oil leak.
The oil leak turned out to be a broken head gasket, which in itself isn't too much of a problem. But during the course of the investigations, it became clear that Nick's perfectly good engine was in fact totally shagged. Not completely dickered like this one, which you'll get to see another time, but just entirely worn out. The more astute among you will have probably already realised where this is going. What we have here is a completely reconditioned block. Now, it may look brand new, but it's actually the same one that came out of the car. The poor old engine had a hard life under Nick's ownership, and the bores had worn out and one had gone oval. So we stripped it, had it hot tanked and overboard with a torque plate to 1/2 mil oversize, cleaned again, surfaced, painted, and we added some nice new core plugs. This reconditioned unit now forms the heart of our engine build. It's a building block, if you will. Yeah, whatever. You write them then. Well, that's all very nice, but according to my calculations, none of the internals that came out of it will now fit. Again, not a problem. All the parts are still readily available. But apparently, it was cheaper to buy performance aftermarket parts than it was to go for genuine Toyota ones. And that has led to a decision.
When I first started getting into cars, all of the cool stuff was naturally aspirated screaming homologation specials. Stuff like Mantas, Chevettes, Escorts, Sunbeams and the like. When I got my driving licence, all of the really quick stuff was first generation second-hand affordable turbo cars with no driver aids, massive turbos and biblical turbo lag. They were, in essence, awful, but they weren't half exciting.
We might have only been able to afford a Metro turbo, or if we were really lucky, an Escort RS turbo, but it felt like we were driving an Audi Quattro or a Renault 5 Turbo Tour de Course.
Fast forward a few years and technology has changed the game completely. These modern small turbos that we've been talking about are now ruthlessly efficient. So much so that in a lot of cars they're barely perceptible, which it's great for drivability and emissions, but it does mean that a lot of turbo cars nowadays just lack any sense of drama. Now, our 3S engine, whilst originally turbocharged, also responds very well to more conventional, naturally aspirated tuning. So well, in fact, that, with the right selection of parts, our just north of 200 horsepower is easily attainable without the use of a small modern turbo. So, the decision has been made, we're just not going to fit one.
So, to build a naturally aspirated 3S engine to north of 200 brake horsepower, as well as a good block, you will need a cleaned and polished forged steel crank, competition mains, big ends and thrust bearings, some decent studs, a genuine Toyota water pump and oil pump, a set of forged steel rods, a set of high compression forged pistons, a set of oversize one-piece race valves, uprated springs and titanium retainers, along with collets to suit, a pair of high lift cams, a pair of adjustable cam pulleys, an expensive cam belt, new OEM idler and tensioner, a complete set of high performance gaskets, a lightweight flywheel, and a new oil filter. Along with some extra tools, you can imagine what that lot did to Nick's wallet. There's a few parts that will be retained off the original engine, like this stuff, and this oil filter housing, but they're a bit manky, so they're all going in the ultrasonic cleaner. The oil filter housing is quite an interesting little widget. It acts as a water to oil heat exchanger, and not only cools the oil without the need for a plumbed-in radiator type thing, but also warms the oil when the engine is cold. It's a very clever and neat solution, but a devil to clean without one of these things. It took a dunk in the alkaline degreaser and a few goes in the ultrasonic bath to get the filter housing clean, but I have to say, I think it's looking pretty good now. The other parts of this assembly have also been jiggled about at 40,000 Hz and are super sparkly, along with the rest of the bits that needed a wash. Talking of needing a wash, Nick is cleaning out the bores in the block. A good rule of thumb when you've had some machining done is to clean it and then clean it again, and when you think it's clean it one more time for luck. The anti-corrosion goop in the bores and on the main bearing journals needs to come off. After a thorough scrubbing and 3 gallons of brake clean, this is what we've managed to get out. First job on the engine assembly is to fit these new gallery bungs. It would be too easy to forget them, so now is as good a time as any. 2 are for the ends of the oil gallery and 1 is to plug up a water outlet. Adding a bit of high strength Loctite means they definitely aren't coming out again anytime soon. Next up are the ARP main studs. Normally the main bearing caps are held in place with bolts. These are fine for the standard engine, but the stud conversion offers more strength than the bolts and therefore a little more peace of mind. They're wound in hand tight as per the instructions from the manufacturer. There's probably no need, but for our own satisfaction we're checking all the machining work, and you might notice some lovely machining here. Our friend Robin at Specialist Engineering in Dunstable runs a fleet of CNC machines and he desperately wanted to get involved with the build, so he offered to make some billet main caps for us. It's very hard to say no to billet main caps, so we reluctantly agreed. And they really are beautiful things. Before torquing them down, the nuts and washers get a liberal coating of the special ARP lube. The torque setting is 60 foot-pounds in 3 steps, so we're going to 20 first, then 40, and finally 60 foot-pounds. The custom main caps really are stunning. Robin made something else for us, which we'll get to later. This assembly has been line bored by experts with better measuring equipment than us, so we're not expecting any problems, but now is the time to find out if there is. They should all be bang on 58mm at room temperature, but as it was barely above freezing when we filmed this, the tiny 100th of a millimetre undersize is understandable. The next job is to measure the actual size of the complete bearing so we can check our clearances. We install all the new ACL shells in the block, and of course in the main caps, before torquing the whole assembly back down again. Each bore is carefully measured and the result is noted down. Then we measure the main journals on the crank with a micrometer, and this result is also recorded. If you do all of them and take one measurement from the other, you end up with the clearances. If we check those against the factory Toyota build manual, we're bang in the middle of the tolerance, so that's great. We perform a similar procedure on the big ends and rods. We'll not bore you with all that, as there's a load of in-depth build videos out there already. Jaffro has done an excellent series on his 4G63 build, for example. Suffice to say, there were no surprises and everything was tickety-boo. The entire crank assembly, including the clutch, flywheel and pulleys, had previously taken a trip to a company called Vibration Free to be balanced. They managed to get our rotating assembly balanced to within F1 spec tolerances, so we're very happy that it's now ready to fit. Mustn't forget the new thrust bearings before laying the crank in the block, and then it's time to release the shmoo. Well, that went well, but what about the end float?
Yeah, it's about right.
The proper way to check it is to carefully set the dial gauge up on the end of the crank, then wedge a lever bar in it to force the crank side to side, and measure the distance. It wants to be around 0.1 of a mil. Sorted. We haven't forgotten about the oil squirters. We've chosen to put those in after the rods and pistons. Talking of which, they're up next. We can't do any of that though with the engine on the bench, so it's time to transfer the block to the engine stand, where it will live until it's pretty much fully assembled. The stand allows us to spin the engine round into almost any position and lock it there. It's also on wheels, which is a blessing and also a curse. The new pistons have a diameter 0.5 mil bigger than the stock size. They're also extremely shiny. We're going to label up the pistons and ring sets in pairs, so we don't get confused as to which pair is meant for which cylinder, as the first job is to gap the rings. The rings have a split in them, so you can pull them apart to fit to the piston. But when it's in the cylinder, the gap between the two ends of the ring is critical. That's because, as the engine heats up, the material expands, and if the gap is too small, the two ends run into each other, which then forces it against the cylinder wall, which creates even more heat, and before you know it, your engine has melted and you're crying into your beer. A ring gap that's too big allows combustion gases through it, wastes power and increases crankcase compression. That's another bad thing, so careful consideration here will ensure a long and happy life for our motor. We checked the lower of the two compression rings first, and out of the box it was spot on, but the top ring is measuring up a little tight, so it needs some fettling. It's not a lot, so a small file does the trick. In no way did we set up a cordless angle grinder on the bench, held by one of us, while the other ground the ends of the ring because that would be dangerous, and you'll not find us doing anything like that. No siree. The top ring on cylinder number 1 has been fettled, so it's time to see if the gap is now right. We're looking for a measurement of 356 microns, or around 14 thou for those so inclined. All the ring gaps have been set, so the next task is to assemble the rods and pistons. The gudgeon pin clips are tricky little blighters, but with some patience and some swearing, they tend to go in after a little persuasion. The conrod now needs to be fitted to the piston. The Yanks call them wrist pins, we call them gudgeon pins, but either way, we're right. The pin slides easily into the little end after the application of some assembly lube, and the filly little clip goes on without too much foul language. Now the rings can be fitted to the piston. The oil scraper rings go on first, followed by the second compression ring, and finally the top ring. And that's one complete piston and conrod assembly ready to go in the engine. One is no good though. We could do with 4. Excellent. Let's lob them at the engine.
Okay, quick sanity check to make sure both clips are in and seated. The gudgeon pin is free in the rod and the piston. And the rings are in correctly and not binding. And I think we can put this in.
A liberal coating of assembly lube is smeared over the big end before what appears to be honey is squeezed onto the piston. It's not honey, of course, that would be weird. No, it's mineral-based engine oil. We've purchased a tapered ring compressor of the correct size for this job, because quite frankly, the universal types are just a bit crap, and this makes it easy and fun. Spinning the motor over on the engine stand to get to the big ends is fantastically handy. The big end gets some more pink shmoo, and the ARP bolts are lubed up and wound into the conrod by hand to start with. They are then tightened down to the required torque. Well, doesn't that look good? Do it 3 more times and you end up with this. It looks almost as good from underneath. Back to the oil squirters. The reason we're putting them back in now and not before the crank went in is that we didn't want to clout the spout with the conrod. These spray oil onto the underside of the piston to keep it cool, so a damaged nozzle could have less than ideal consequences. A little dab of blue Loctite should stop the caphead bolt from dropping into the crank, and like all these fairly critical engine fasteners, they get torqued up to the correct specification. The final check here is to make sure that the squirter doesn't foul the piston, and thankfully it doesn't. So that's great. We've got a bit of dull stuff to assemble now, like the crankshaft oil seals, oil pump, pulley and sump. So while Nick gets on with that, I'm gonna get the funk out. We had our modified sump powder coated while we were at Andy's, and it's looking resplendent in its new finish of satin black. Some new fasteners with a dab of Loctite should keep the windage tray in place and the bolts out of the turny bits. The sump can't go back on just yet because if you recall, we need to gain back some of the oil capacity lost when Nick sliced out the space for the downpipe. To do that, we enlisted Robin at Specialist Engineering again to make us a 10mm spacer. As we expected, it's beautifully machined and made out of gauge plate to ensure a perfectly flat surface for the sump to seal on. After the high tensile cap heads are torqued down, we just check to see that there's no clearance issues. And yep, everything looks to be fine.
There's no point having 10mm extra depth in the sump unless the pickup's right at the bottom, and that is where this comes in. But before we fit it, I'm going to prime the oil pump.
Priming the oil pump mainly consists of pouring pink gloop down a funnel, then spinning the pulley over by hand. Rocket science, it is not.
Gooey.
With the pump primed, the bottom end can now be finished with the addition of the oil pickup, freshly cleaned, ultrasonically, another smearing of sealant, the sump gasket, and finally the sump itself. A 1/4" drive adapter in the end of your drill set to the lowest torque makes winding in lots of bolts an absolute doddle. Then it's just a case of torquing them up. I hope you're appreciating all this, Tom. And that's the sump, spacer and oil pickup sorted. Before we forget, let's thwack in the dipstick mount cup thing. That's the official term, honest. It took us no time at all to rebuild the water pump and the oil cooler assembly. You might have noticed we're using brand new nuts and bolts wherever possible. And hose clamps. The new thermostat has what's delightfully called a jiggle valve in it, and that needs lining up with the handy casting mark in the housing before going on to the water pump. The dipstick bracket is added before the water outlet on the back side of the block is done up. Next job is to seal up the turbo oil feed, and we've whipped up a blanking boss for that. We're nearly there with the long block assembly, just the small matter of the head dowels to tap in with the soft hammer, and the addition of 10 new ARP head studs. Sorted. Now we just need a head gasket. A multi-layer steel Cometic one would probably do the trick.
I think we're pretty much ready for the head, which luckily I haven't had anything to do with because therein lies a bit of a story.
To match the spec of the bottom end, we decided to have some work done on the top end, and to avoid delays come assembly time, all the outsourced machining was done a long time ago. You know, to get ahead of the game. We had our head seen to by a master machinist near Silverstone. He took it off us and over the course of a couple of weeks ported and polished the inlet and exhausts, changed the valve guides, gave us 3-angle valve seats, skimmed the head and generally cleaned it up to give us some serious gas flow. We were very excited, even though the new cams bound in the journals, meaning they had to line hone the cam caps to make them fit properly. Still, at least we then knew everything was spot on. Well, that's all lovely, but in what turned out to be yet another biblically over-optimistic plan, I decided it would be a brilliant idea to simply put the whole thing together so it's ready to go come engine build time. It was at this point that it all went to shit. The first thing I wanted to do was change the risky shim over bucket design of cam follower for the much less dicey shimless bucket from the Toyota 2ZZ engine. and as we had new cams and all the clearances needed doing anyway, this was the perfect opportunity. I measured all the followers, lapped all the valves in, by hand I'll have you know, none of this whack it on a drill and let the chuck do the work, and began the assembly by fitting the valve stem oil seals. Only I couldn't, because they didn't fit. Cue a whole load of research and arsing around trying to find some that do. Eventually, some special Ford ones arrive and I can get on with the job of assembling the head. There are over 170 individual parts that make up this cylinder head, and assembly is time consuming and tricky. The idea is that we'll use one-piece cam followers, or buckets, straight from Toyota to replace the two-piece design that can have problems with high-lift cams. To do that, we need to measure all the clearances as they are now, and then order the correct size bucket to give us the required gap between the cam and the follower. Simple. Only it wasn't. What I was about to learn was that the base circle diameter of the new cams was 0.5 mm smaller than the standard ones, and that meant there were no shimless buckets thick enough to give me the correct clearance. Brilliant. What it also meant was that our titanium retainers and uprated valve springs wouldn't fit the revised shim under bucket design we were being now forced to use. Plus, I'd now have to take the whole thing apart again. I produced a spreadsheet with all the measurements, ordered all the parts, and sat on it for a while. About a year, in fact. The new shims look like this, and the buckets have a pocket for them to sit in. So after completely disassembling the head and building it back up with the different retainers and springs, the new followers can go in. Once the buckets are fitted, the cams and cam caps get thrown on and torqued down to spec. With a bit of luck, I won't have to do this again on this engine. If I've got my calculations correct, this feeler gauge should slip in snugly. And it does. And so do the rest of them. So I'm calling that job done. That turned out to be quite the ordeal, but it's amazing what you can accomplish with a can-do attitude.
Oh my god. Can we just fit it now?
Yes we can. Well, not quite yet. It needs a wipe off with some brake cleaner and a new rag. Look at him, breaking out the clean rags willy-nilly. Like it. It's quite nerve-wracking really, because with all those new parts installed, if I've done anything wrong, it'll be my head on the block. 5 frickin' years I've waited for that one. Hello, what's he doing now? Ah yes, with the head bolts changed for ARP studs, you have to put the washers on ahead of time, because they're wider than the casting, so you have to sort of slip them in. But with the washers in place, the head can now be properly lowered onto the block. A little expert wiggling jiggles the washers over the studs. I think that's what they call techers, or something. It's impossible to overstate just how much I love these HKS cam pulleys. Anyway, enough of the part porn, back to business. We need to time the cams in, and for that we need a degree wheel and a pointer for starters. To find TDC or top dead centre, we've screwed a flat piece of steel to the top of the head to allow us to mount the magnetic stand on. The digital indicator is mounted in the arm, and the probe goes down through the spark plug hole and will rest on top of the piston. Then we turn the crank over, and as the piston rises it moves the probe on the indicator. When the indicator shows its maximum value, we know that the piston is at the top of its travel. That happens to be 6.21mm on the gauge, but the measurement is irrelevant, so we reset it to 0. Then you spin the timing disc round to read top and lock it off. But that isn't top dead centre, because the piston stays put at the top of the stroke as the crank rotates. So keep turning it until the indicator shows the piston moving down, and then read off how many degrees that is. Here it's 3 degrees. So you split the difference, move the pointer back 1.5 degrees, and that is top dead centre. To get the cam timing somewhere near, Toyota have handily given us a mark on the cover plate behind the pulley. So it's as easy as lining up the mark on the pulley with the line on the back plate. And now I suppose we should put the belt on.
No, that's just what they'll be expecting us to do. So instead, what we're going to do next is take the fairly unusual step of priming the entire oil system. Because we can.
Most road car engines have their oil pumps deep inside the motor. They tend to be gear or chain driven and are completely inaccessible. However, on the 3S engine, the oil pump is external and driven off the timing belt. This gives us the opportunity to test the system long before the engine is first cranked over. We needed to remove the timing disc and fit the sump plug, oil filter and the freshly plated dipstick tube, but now the engine isn't porous, we can fill it with some mineral-based running-in oil. We've got the drill set to around 300 to 400 revs, so not even half idle speed, and you can see oil pouring out of where the pressure sensor goes. If I hold my finger over it, the oil gets directed past the cam followers and is filling up the channels nicely. I'm calling that a win. There'll be oil already in the galleries before the engine is even started, so that's great. And there's no leaks. Woo, and might I add, who. Time to put the timing belt on, and we've chosen a Gates racing belt in a slightly odd shade of blue. Not sure it goes with the purple cam wheels, but you're not going to be able to see any of it anyway, so who cares? We're just going to wedge a screwdriver in here to give us some belt tension, as we don't want to pull the pin on the sprung tensioner until we're ready. Just checking that the engine turns and that there's no nasty valve to piston contact. We're lucky to have the ear of a world-renowned engine tuner, and although the engine will now run as it is, he's told us that we need 0.75mm of valve lift on the inlet cam at top dead centre. We can't argue with him, so that's what we're doing. It's easy to adjust with these vernier slide pulleys. You just slacken off the 3 screws, put a great big spanner on the cam, and just give it a little tweak. We were at 0.55mm lift, so we don't need much movement to get it spot on. Then just tighten the 3 screws, and that's the inlet cam timing sorted. We did the same on the exhaust cam, but this time to the prescribed 0.25mm lift at top dead centre. Now that we're happy with the timing, we can pull the tensioner pin. Better just see if it still turns over nicely. Yep, very happy with that. Nearly there. We had the rocker cover powder coated at the same time as the rest of the running gear, and now it just needs a little reassembly before going back onto the engine. If any of the little cap head bolts in here dropped out and into the top end, that would be bad, so they're getting a little dab of thread lock and they're done up to FT. Pretty much the last job now is to fit the new rocker cover gasket. He's getting faster with that hammer all the time.
Yes, I know it's not the same colour, but the block's really heavy and I thought a lighter grey might help.
Just get that cover screwed down, please. The rocker cover bolts are the final ones for now that need torquing down. That sure is looking nice, but there's one tiny bit missing. There you go.
Alright, I think we're done for now, aren't we, mate?
Well, can I talk to you for a minute?
Oh dear, it seems Richard is upset. Well, no, I don't really mean upset, I mean concerned. About Ted. You see, he's been reading back through the comments and he's come across a lot of people who are very worried about the final weight of Binky, and he's kind of taken it to heart. You see, rural Shropshire is an excellent place to live, it's just we're not really blessed with massive sections of long, straight, wide road. Not a problem, because when there's no one about, you can still make some excellent progress. Now, every driver in the world knows what it's like to be stuck behind a truck or a bus. But around here, you're just as likely to have to anchor on for a horse, a flock of sheep, a tractor, or a coffin dodger in a Honda Jazz. Why is it always a Jazz? It's all about time exposed to danger, or TED, the amount of time you need to spend on the wrong side of the road when you're forced to overtake some of these obstacles. Now, given our expertly predicted final power to weight figures, and despite my best tuning efforts, Richard is really worried that we're just not going to be able to drive this car around safely. But apparently, he's been doing some research and he's come up with a quick and cost-effective solution.
I certainly have. What we needed was a little bit of extra waft to make those limited overtaking opportunities a lot less hazardous. So I found a place in the States at the cutting edge of technology that produces a suitable device. The Garrett Safety Turbo. They actually do quite the range, but we're still space limited. So while not as safe as it could be, we should be able to meet our safety requirements with this GTX 3582R. Tune in next time for another exciting episode from the files of Project Binky.
This is about safety, is it?
Oh yeah.
That's what you're going with.
Well, no choice.
Mm-hmm.